Hi, welcome back for part 2 in my series about Game of Thrones' worst mistake, the marriage between Ramsay Bolton and Sansa Stark. Previously, I covered why exactly the choices that the Boltons made when it came to Sansa seemed to be the worst decisions that they could make. And, while the behavior of the Boltons and their treatment of Sansa Stark is completely baffling and nonsensical, and all of their choices and behaviors seem to revolve around ensuring that Sansa suffers as much as she possibly can, unfortunately, they're hardly the only ones. Unsurprisingly, when characters need to be dumbed down in order for a bad storyline to work, the smarter that a certain character is portrayed to be, the more drastically they're going to have to be altered in order to accommodate for the newly required stupidity. Unfortunately, there are plenty of characters that have had to go from the smartest to the dumbest person in the room, but arguably the character who underwent the fastest and most dramatic change was Petyr Baelish. Petyr Baelish is portrayed as arguably the best and most talented politician in the series. And while many people in noble families have set their sights on the Iron Throne, Littlefinger is truly one of the only people who has managed to pull himself from near to the bottom of the ladder and establish himself as a true contender for the throne. Despite the fact that he was born with almost no claim to anything and almost no power in a society that relies on tradition, and whose class stratification is nearly impossible to navigate. Given that Petyr is someone who has no lands or armies, he has to rely on the connections that he develops in order to gain power. And one of his best skills as a social climber in a world where moving up even one rung on the ladder is nearly impossible, is that he firstly makes his gains through soft power. And secondly, that he typically waits for a soft power vacuum and fills it every time an opportunity presents itself. And of course, one of his best soft power acquisition moves was abducting Sansa Stark and becoming her sole trusted guardian. Although the Iron Throne has been Littlefinger's goal for years, there are few things that are more valuable both to his quest to become king, and to him personally, than Sansa Stark. One of the biggest boons in Littlefinger's ascent to the top of the political ladder has been conveniently stepping in to take complete control over the most powerful children in Westeros. First with Robb and Arryn, and then with Sansa. However, Sansa is an even more important tool in his tool belt. Both because the North makes up nearly half the landmass of the Seven Kingdoms, but more importantly because anyone with a shred of political awareness would understand that the Northern quest for independence isn't over. Meaning that if Littlefinger wants to be in control of a united Seven Kingdoms, then holding the key to the North is almost like holding the key to the Iron Throne itself. And of course, Baelish has an extreme personal investment in Sansa as well. Now that Cat is gone, never to fulfill Petyr's childhood dreams, Sansa is his only hope of getting back what he feels like he lost. And that is honestly the main incepting factor for his political aspirations in the first place. But Sansa isn't just Cat. She's something better. She's a means by which Petyr can project his weird fantasies of having one cat earlier on, because she's both Catelyn's daughter and pretending to be Petyr's. She can play as a proxy for Cat because of their similarities, but she can be something much better for a weirdo creep like Littlefinger, because she can both be Cat for him, and now that he's raising her from girlhood, he can mold her into his literal fantasy woman. Suffice it to say that there are few things in this world that would matter more to Petyr Baelish than Sansa Stark does. Which is, of course, why his choices in Season 5 of Game of Thrones are all the more nonsensical. Once again, the writers of the show have made a simple one-to-one exchange in the storyline. In the books, Petyr is the one who hands Jeyne Poole over to the Boltons, and in the show, he's the one who hands Sansa over to them. But there's absolutely nothing equivalent about these two scenarios. Although Jeyne has been missing from the book story for some time by the time she becomes a hostage for the Boltons, it's implied that Littlefinger has been holding on to her and likely not treating her very well. Much like with the Boltons, Jeyne herself holds little to no value as an individual. She really only provides any utility for people like Baelish or the Boltons because she's a northern girl who is extremely familiar with Winterfell, which is convenient for the plan that the Boltons and the Crown have in store. But of course, the real Sansa Stark is a far more valuable hostage. Arguably the most valuable hostage in Westeros at the time that Petyr abducts her. There are plenty of elements of Petyr's plans in the TV series that make no sense, but the most obvious and baffling one is that Sansa is married to Tyrion already. The reasons that the Lannisters married her into their family is obvious, and while having Sansa on hand is the most important aspect of this plan, the fact that she has a living husband does legally protect them from losing control of the North unless Sansa is no longer the heir to the North. And attempting to arrange a betrothal with Harry Harding is one thing. Even attempting to arrange some sort of betrothal agreement with the Boltons would have made some sense. But Sansa can't marry anyone. Handing her over to the Boltons so that Ramsay can immediately marry her makes zero sense because it would literally not be a legally recognizable marriage. Nor would any children that came from this illegal marriage be recognized as legal heirs, which Littlefinger would clearly know. In the books, it's obvious that Littlefinger does know this, because frankly, if marrying Sansa off was even an option, Littlefinger would have likely married her off to someone, or married her himself, as soon as possible. Because after all, she's an incredibly valuable hostage, but she's only valuable to whoever is actually holding her at the time. And as Petyr's Sansa stealing hat trick has already demonstrated, she can trade hands pretty easily. And that really dovetails into another aspect of Baelish's behavior that is so astoundingly idiotic that it doesn't even hold up to the slightest amount of scrutiny. Because the main value in having Sansa Stark under your control is having Sansa Stark under your control. Again, it would be one thing to attempt to facilitate some kind of agreement with the Boltons, but even the dumbest person on Earth would not simply hand Sansa over to the Boltons. Aside from the fact that relinquishing control over Sansa would be completely against Petyr's best interests and personal desires, Sansa is the only leverage that Petyr has in his agreement with the Boltons. Sansa is the only thing of value that he has and that the Boltons want, and he just gives her to them and leaves. Which is another aspect of his character arc in this bizarre switch-up that makes no sense. Because it would be one thing to actually return Sansa to Winterfell to make this agreement, but the notion that Baelish would take her back into Winterfell and then leave her there without anyone he controls to watch over her or keep the situation going the way he wants to is utterly incomprehensible. First off, Littlefinger is supposed to be the greatest politician of all time, but he brings Sansa to the North without actually having any understanding of the current political situation of the North, and without having any political connections in the North. Basic common sense would dictate that Sansa Stark is the most valuable Northerner in the world right now, especially in the eyes of someone who isn't aware that there are other surviving Starks. Ergo, everyone in the kingdom would like to get their hands on Sansa. And Littlefinger supposedly brings her back to the heart of the North, all on her own, without even taking a moment to look into the statuses of other northern houses. What their political motivations are? He doesn't even bother looking into whether or not any of these northerners would be able to recognize Sansa on sight. Despite the fact that the moment it became known that she was back in the North, logically nearly every northern house would be interested in retrieving her. Given how far the journey to Winterfell is, and given that there are actually quite a few Northmen who would likely know Sansa if they saw her, it even stretches the bounds of believability that they made it all the way there without being intercepted. And yes, most people didn't realize that Jeyne and Arya weren't the same person, but Arya was much younger when she left and would have gone through a bigger growth spurt. Not to mention, Sansa's exceptional good looks have always been a narrative point, and plenty of northern lords were likely angling to potentially arrange a marriage pact with Sansa prior to her going south. And, setting aside the fact that Littlefinger essentially abandoned his insanely valuable hostage and seemingly relied on his extensive grooming to keep her under his thumb when literally every northern house would be guaranteed to come after her and help her if they knew she was there, the audience is also supposed to believe that he did absolutely no due diligence when it came to ensuring that the Boltons were actually following his plan. Or to ensure that they weren't such violent psychopaths that Sansa wouldn't immediately do anything to escape. This is an absolutely baffling choice for someone like Littlefinger. Even if he never heard any of the rumors of what kind of a person Ramsay Bolton is, even his minuscule knowledge of the Boltons should have at worst prompted him to do more investigating, and at best prompted him to not make any arrangements with them at all. After all, This is the northern house that betrayed and killed their own king in order to align with the Lannisters. That should presumably both make Littlefinger wary that they might double-cross him for the Lannisters, or that they might double-cross him and immediately tell him to get bent because they have Sansa and he has nothing valuable left to offer them. Or they might double-cross him and do something with or to Sansa that doesn't go according to plan. And unfortunately, the probability of that seems incredibly high. Because, while Sansa Stark is an extremely valuable hostage, a Sansa Stark who is married to Tyrion Lannister and has returned to Winterfell is exactly the kind of person that the Boltons would want, so that they could execute her. Because yes, if she were free to be wedded, then she's their key to the north. But if she's already married, then she's just a Stark in Winterfell that the entire north can rally around. According to the show's own canon, Sansa poses almost as much of a threat as someone like Rickon does, which someone as intelligent and politically skilled as Petyr should obviously know. And honestly, this doesn't even factor in Sansa herself. All of these things would apply even if she were a completely mindless idiot, which Littlefinger himself knows she's not. Yes, he's put a lot of effort into grooming her, but how would he know that the minute that he was gone, she wasn't plotting her own escape? Her submission to him in the Vale entirely depends on the fact that Littlefinger is the only person she can rely on at the time. But he wouldn't know how she'd react if that weren't the case. And sticking her right back into the safest place for her, where there are plenty of people who know her and would help her, is a massive risk to take. And there's an interesting contrast here as well, because both within the books and the TV series, Sansa stays in King's Landing after she marries Tyrion. But why is that? If Tyrion is going to be the new Lord of Winterfell, why wouldn't they go to Winterfell? Well, for exactly this reason. Because Sansa Stark is only a valuable hostage if someone actually has her. And if the Lannisters sent her back to Winterfell, even with her husband Tyrion, the probability that Tyrion is murdered and Sansa is taken by another northern house is pretty close to 100%. And not only does Littlefinger take Sansa to the north, he leaves her there unguarded. So he can go south and ask Cersei's permission to take the Knights of the Vale to the north to attack. Despite the fact that he's already in control of the Vale, and he already plans to betray Cersei anyway. He essentially goes from one end of the country to the other, and leaves behind his most valuable hostage, so he can lie to Cersei face to face when she's going to discover his betrayal the minute it happens anyway. It's honestly such a nonsensical and bizarre plan that it seems solely designed to put Sansa in a position to be victimized by Ramsay. There are plenty of aspects of it that are the dumbest of dumb, but this quite literally makes no sense. The role that Littlefinger plays in this story arc is astonishingly idiotic, but it's all the more noticeable because he's supposed to be such a brilliant political mastermind. His choices when it comes to Sansa are in direct opposition to every aspect of his fundamental characterization. And unfortunately, he's not the first or last character to be completely rewritten in order to facilitate Sansa's abuse. But I'll be getting more into that next time. And what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in comments below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.